Okay, hello everyone. I hope that you enjoyed your coffee break and that you have made some new connections and enjoyed catching up with existing connections. We are going to start off with the first panel of this year's iteration of the annual conference on Russia. And this year's theme is Perpetual Conflict, Russia and the Struggle for European Security. And that really does capture a reality that's come to define the security environment of the region and the strategic landscape of the continent. So, as you all know, for a lot of the period after the Cold War, there was this hope that Europe had entered a fundamentally new era, one in which interstate war on the continent had become not just unlikely, but rather unthinkable. That is no longer true. And the prevailing assumption of that time period was that integration, economic interdependence, and shared institutions would gradually overcome rivalries of the past. That is now also no longer true. And the events of the previous couple of decades, since 2008, 2014, and 2022, has really demonstrated that that presumption was premature. Russia's aggressive actions against Ukraine and their nonlinear acts of aggression against the West have really forced Europe to confront a more enduring and uncomfortable reality that the contest over principles which govern European security maybe didn't actually end. Rather, it evolved, and it's still evolving. But the struggle that we're witnessing right now is broader than simply the battlefield. It includes the weaponization of energy and economic ties, the use of cyber and information operations, political interference, and efforts to reshape the norms and institutions which really underpin European security. So in this sense, the concept of perpetual conflict does not necessarily imply constant war in a conventional sense, but there are a lot of question marks about how that might evolve. But it does reflect a condition of enduring strategic competition, one which unfolds simultaneously across military, political, economic, and informational domains. So how do we understand Russia's long-term strategic objectives, and what does it mean for the future of deterrence and defense in Europe and the security environment of this continent? So I would like to kick it off to the panelists after I introduce them, because we're going to unpack a lot today. We have an extended, a fairly long panel, so we have a lot of time to discuss. So Lord Robertson to my left joins us as a panelist, and thank you very much once again, Lord Robertson, for your keynote speech. We have to Lord Robertson's left, Brian Whitmore. Brian is an assistant professor of practice at the University of Texas-Arlington McDowell Center for Global Studies, and Brian is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center in Washington, D.C. He is the founder and author of the Power Vertical blog and host of the Power Vertical podcast, both of which focus on Russian affairs. To Brian's left is Professor Sven Biscop, who read political science and obtained his PhD at Ghent University, where today he is a professor who lectures on grand strategy and great powers, and also on Belgian foreign and defense policy. In addition, Professor Biscop is the director of the Europe and the World program at Egmont, the Royal Institute for International Affairs in Brussels, and that is a think tank associated with the Belgian MFA. And since October of 2025, he is the acting Director General of the Institute. To Professor Biscop's left, we are joined by Peter Slezkine, who is a senior fellow and director of the Russia program at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., and he is the host of the Trilogue podcast, which is a series of one-on-one conversations which feature guests from the United States, Russia, and China. Peter has expertise on U.S. foreign policy and the former Soviet Union and Sino-Russian relations. Prior to joining the Stimson Center, Peter was the director of the Monterey Trilogue at Middlebury Institute of International Studies, and he received his doctorate in history from Columbia University and has gone on to hold fellowships at East China Normal University, the Wilson Center, the Clement Center, and the University of Texas, Austin, as well as the Belfer Center at the Harvard University's Kennedy School. So we're in very good and capable hands. So the way that we'll run the panel is I'll give each of you 6 to 7 minutes for opening remarks. Then we'll have a moderated discussion, and the concluding half an hour, we'll kick it over to the audience for a Q&A. When you ask a question, I would kindly ask you to briefly introduce yourself by name and institutional affiliation, and to the panelists to which you you direct your question to. So, Lord Robertson, the floor is yours.
Well, since I've already spoken, it may be redundant to go into another spiel. But what I didn't refer to in my opening remarks was the Strategic Defence Review, which the British government has just completed. I was asked by the Shadow Defence Secretary early last year, before the election, if along with a retired general and a foreign policy expert, we would do an independent review of the way in which Britain did its defences. And when the election was announced, the Prime Minister announced that we were going to do this strategic defence review. We would do it inside the Ministry of Defence, but that we would have a degree of external independence in order to do it. So we spent a year, myself, General Barons, who had been one of the military chiefs, and Dr. Fiona Hill, who had worked with Donald Trump during the first administration and had written probably the finest book about Vladimir Putin that has been written so far. So the three of us plus a team of 6 experts, independent experts, then looked at every aspect of United Kingdom defence, all areas, not just the hardware, but also the attitude and the mindset that was going to be required for the future. We involved at least 150 experts in this whole process of review and challenge as we spent the year. And ultimately, the government, the Prime Minister, accepted our review, and it was published as a government document. And the 62 recommendations that we made have all got now to be implemented, and the Prime Minister has given his authority to it. So it was an interesting way in which an external view was brought to that. So my brief elevator speech at the end of it, having done it, having looked at every aspect of defence, was really quite brutal. And it applies not just to the United Kingdom, it applies elsewhere in Europe. We are underprepared, we're underinsured, we're under attack, and we're therefore not safe. So a year's work sort of summed up in that respect. The basic theme was that we need to rebuild warfighting readiness in order to be able to deter any future adversary to our nation and to the alliance as a whole. And that is what General Grinchevich, the Supreme Allied Commander, is now intent on doing on an alliance-wide basis. He's getting a lot of help from the Baltic states, who are spending precisely what is required and doing what he wants them to do. Other nations are less keen on doing it, but at the recent Hague summit, the heads of state and government signed up to 5% of GDP being spent on defence, 3.5% plus 1.5% on infrastructure. In the case of the United Kingdom, that would mean an extra £85 billion being spent annually on defence, and a budget at the present moment is 70 billion. So you're virtually doubling and more the defence budget. I sent a text message to my successor, Mark Rutte, when he got that agreement, and saying, first of all, it must not be seen as lip service. It needs to mean something. Secondly, you need to convene a North Atlantic Council at finance ministers level. It's all very well ministers of defence, ministers of foreign affairs, and even heads of state and government agreeing to these eye-watering amounts, and they are eye-watering amounts of money, unless finance ministers know how it's going to be acquired and deployed. Now, as yet, it hasn't happened. I tried it when I was Secretary General, and they refused to come. But I think there's now a point in time where the obligation has been made and signed in blood with the President of the United States of America. It has to be delivered, but it won't be easy to do. You know, we're under attack from Russia, from China, from North Korea, from Iran. Less so from Iran at the present moment, but we're under attack in the grey zone, the hybrid warfare zone. Of that, there is absolutely no doubt at all, and they talk about being at war. But at the same time, we need to face the prospect of a full-scale war with a peer-armed adversary within the next 10 years. Our Prime Minister made a speech at Munich just a week ago, pointing out that that NATO was saying that there might well be a war with Russia by the end of the decade. Sounds a long time. The end of the decade is just 3.5 years away. So we need to be ready, and we need to get that war-fighting readiness up. I'm the only person so far to have invoked Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. That is as everybody in this room knows, is the aspect that says an attack on one country is an attack on all countries. And I made the declaration the day after America was hit on 9/11. It may well be, I firmly believe that I'm the only person ever to invoke Article 5, because I don't believe any adversary is going to take the risks involved in crossing that line, and that line is just up the road from here. But that depends on us having the capability to be sure that we can deter, that we've got the readiness and the war-fighting readiness available to make sure that that doesn't actually happen. Interestingly enough, we also focused in our review on Article 3 of the North Atlantic Treaty. Less well known than Article 5. Article 4 has, of course, been invoked. It's the article that says we think we're going to be attacked and we want help. Article 3 says that individual countries must look after their own defences in order to contribute to collective security. In 1998, when I did my first review as Defence Secretary, we had a moat round the British Isles, and we were a long way from trouble, a long way from missiles of that time. That doesn't apply now. Does not apply in the era of hypersonic missiles and the kind of armour that is now available that could strike London from very, very far distances as well. So the basis of homeland defence plus war readiness is the basis of what we said, and the basis of what NATO is going to have to be in the future if we are to ensure that nobody in future has to invoke Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty.
Thank you, Lord Robertson. Peter, I'd like to turn it to you, because there is this notion that something is coming. We don't know what. You know, I was in the United States Marine Corps. We have a saying, pray for peace, prepare for war. So it's always better to be prepared. But we do have some strategic foresight to look into the future. But Peter, I wanted to talk to you about this concept of the free world and its successor, the liberal world order. And if you could just walk us a little bit through how it relies upon and produces this perpetual conflict. So the floor is yours, Peter.
Thank you very much. So the presumption of this panel and of the conference as a whole is perpetual conflict with Russia. And I think that proposition bears further examination. And more precisely, I think it is worth exploring how this American perception of perpetual conflict with Russia has shaped the so-called US-led liberal order, and what might happen to the perception of Russia, or Russia's role, if the US gets out of the business of free world leadership. From the founding of the United States through the mid-1930s, more or less, roughly speaking, American policymakers and the American public held to one rather simple schema of the world. There was a single globe divided in two, a new world of freedom, an old world of tyranny. These two worlds were geographically separated, which guaranteed security. So the relationship between them, one could describe as peaceful coexistence, to use a phrase that appeared quite a bit later on. This vision was supplanted or defeated in the late 1930s and during World War II, and replaced by a worldview that was superficially similar, but carried quite different political implications. And this was a picture of a globe that had shrunk and become, in security terms, interconnected, so that the contest between a free world and a slave world, as they were called at the time, was zero-sum. Stakes were existential, and neither of them occupied a definite physical space, but represented potentially alternative futures. So one or the other of these worlds would prevail, and the entire world would become either free or slave. As the free world, the United Nations looked poised to win this battle. Another slogan appeared in the American consciousness and vocabulary, and that is the phrase "one world," which was the title of a best-selling book authored by Wendell Willkie, who was Roosevelt's Republican opponent in the 1942 election and then became one of his important supporters. So one world was the sign under which the war ended, the idea that for a stable peace to endure, the world had to cohere and cooperate as one. And the United Nations was created under this one world. But of course, that vision of one world, at least as the Americans imagined it, did not last very long, and it once more split in two. Again, the free world and the slave world. But this time, there was no expectation of a decisive resolution of this conflict in immediate terms. So the free world became the long-standing foundation of American foreign policy, from the seminal strategy document NSC 68 to any number of other secret and public declarations. Building up the free world, leading the free world, was placed at the absolute center of American foreign policy. And the free world occupied definite physical space. Its principal feature as a concept was its negative definition. The free world was identified exactly with the entire non-communist world. This negative definition produced a series of foreign policy pathologies. A strategically unsustainable commitment to global reactive containment, an intolerance of non-alignment, an inability to devise a positive unifying ideology, and a consequent insistence on the apparent persistence of an existential external threat as the only source of internal coherence for this non-communist free world. To demonstrate this last point, I'd like to quickly read a quote from a 1956 National Security Strategy or National Security Council report. This is 1956, right after Khrushchev's secret speech in which he denounces Stalin. And this internal memo warns that if the USSR succeeds in improving its reputation for peaceful intentions, such efforts will present the United States with a serious threat, likely to lead to gradual erosion of free world positions. So the free world had found itself in a paradoxical position where the greatest threat to the free world was the apparent diminution of the threat posed by the Soviet Union. And it doesn't matter whether that sort of sense of reduced threat was real or not, whether the Soviet Union actually posed more or less of a threat. The sense by any members within the free world that the threat diminished was a mortal threat itself to the free world. This is how the United States understood it. There are many quotations of this kind that I could share. So this is basically the American foreign policy all the way through. The collapse of the communist bloc leads to another one world moment. Like after World War II, this one lasts a full decade. But after 9/11, the world divides in two once more. George W. Bush declares a division between the free world and the axis of evil or radical fundamentalist Islam. Once again, defined negatively, freedom is that which they want to destroy. They hate us for our freedom. With Obama's second term, as the global war on terror was winding down, China and Russia, predictably, I think, acquired greater importance as threats within this construction. And this culminates or climaxes with Biden's election. He initially attempts a positive definition of a renewed free world. We all remember the Summit of Democracy. That enterprise was a failure, trying to devise a list of who to invite and whom not to, according to some criteria, proved very difficult. And this problem was solved in the 2022 National Security Strategy by reverting to the original definition from 1950 that the liberal order is everything that China and Russia seek to undermine. Trump's return marks perhaps the end of this era. He and his administration openly call for the dissolution of the liberal order. They don't like the idea either of one world or the liberal order, and have proposed at various times a series of alternatives: the nation state, Western Hemisphere hegemony, Western civilization, and sometimes outright empire. But all of these, sometimes contradictory or whatever, inconsistent among themselves, are explicit alternatives to the liberal order. So what does this mean? One possibility is it doesn't mean much of anything at all. Trump has not pulled out completely from Ukraine or done a deal with Putin. He has motivated NATO members to spend more, and he has just launched a war against Iran, framed more or less in familiar terms about bringing freedom to benighted areas far from the homeland. I think the status quo is not durable in this respect. The war in Iran is deeply unpopular in the United States. Trump's America First base feels betrayed, and if anything, anti-interventionist attitudes, I think, will increase among younger generations. Younger Republicans, are also fairly, aggressively anti-Atlanticist in their great majority. Democrats have a slightly greater affection for the Atlantic Alliance and more conventional in their understanding of Russia, but there's no bringing back Biden. Newsom will be a different animal no matter what, and I think people in this room probably agree that something fundamental has changed in the transatlantic relationship. So to finish, I see three paths forward. One is a reboot of the transatlantic relationship. The specter of perpetual conflict with Russia is not a strong enough glue to hold the transatlantic alliance together for much longer. Much of Europe, certainly the United States, does not perceive the threat in the same terms as this country does. So a reboot could be a pivot away from the old tanks and troops model to a new tech and trade logic, where the tank and troops model is directed against Russia. A trade and tech arrangement would measure itself against China, but it would not be negatively defined in the same sense. It wouldn't require China. It would, if enacted properly, strengthen all member nations as they together manage resources, outer space, AI, and so forth. And every one would occupy some spot in this coalition, in this tech stack. A second possibility is a withdrawal of the United States, abrupt or progressive, from European security, and Europe then cohering and integrating further with an absolute focus on the Russia threat, perpetual conflict, as the one way to create this cohesion and to further this project. And finally, it is possible that as the US withdraws, Europe fragments. Europe has been united twice in history, under Rome and under the American hegemony. The norm is obviously fragmentation. And if Europe fragments, then the Russia threat will only be felt by certain countries and not necessarily by others who might then start looking at one another. These are ideal type scenarios. As far as I can tell, there's movement now in all three directions simultaneously. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Certainly a lot of questions to ask when we get to the moderated session between us. But I'd like to turn now to you, Professor Biscop, to talk about this rupture in transatlantic relations, because I think that the big, NATO's center of gravity politically is, of course, the cohesion of the alliance. But as Peter alluded to, it may be a difference of opinion if we try to pinpoint what is causing what and why things are, but I think there is a general sense that something has fundamentally changed. So, Sven, over to you to discuss the current status of transatlantic relations and how you see it in terms of rupture and what that means for security.
Right, thank you. I must say, Lord Robertson, I appreciated the historical references in your speech, and history is very important. In Brussels, as you probably know, we still have a Stalingrad Avenue, actually. I think it should stay Stalingrad Avenue because that's worth remembering as the turning point of the war in Europe. We also have a Montgomery roundabout, of course, which is probably a bit of a misnomer because I don't think Montgomery ever went about anything in a roundabout way, but that's another issue. To the case at hand, the point I want to make is that in its foreign policy, the US is becoming a normal country, and that is bad news, because you could say that the transatlantic relation was in a way abnormal. It was a genuinely special relationship, and because we are allies, we are also still competitors, economically, politically, but we agreed we would never be rivals. That competition would always take place within a legal framework. That's now gone. We have a US administration that uses illegal tariffs against us, that claims our own territory in Greenland, and that interferes in our domestic politics, which is as much of an unwanted hybrid action as any Chinese or Russian hybrid action. And you can read it all black and white why they are doing it in the December National Security Strategy, which says that Europe is at risk of civilizational erasure, slightly hyperbolic. Who is creating this risk? The European Union. I mean, when I read that the first time, I was impressed. I was impressed, let's say. So this is a rupture. This is a rupture with American foreign policy since 1945. And I think it's a structural change, because you could say, well, this is this administration, and after Trump there will be another president, and it could be that Trump's successor may be somebody whom we really, really like, but everybody now knows that the successor of the successor can be a MAGA person again. In other words, how steadfast or how trustworthy the US is as an ally now depends on who wins the elections in the United States, and that was never the case before. So I think this is a structural change. We may not like the fact, but I think it would be foolish to ignore it and pretend that this is just, that this is a blip. No, this is a permanent change, and it has important consequences. And I want to just highlight two for the war against Ukraine and for our own collective defense. I think for us in Europe, the longer the war has been going on, the more vital it becomes to our own security. I would argue that although Ukraine is not a member, neither of the EU nor of NATO, that in reality our defensive perimeter is the front line between Ukraine and Russia. It's not a border between us and Russia. Plus you have an army of 1 million soldiers in uniform that now count on our side of the balance of power. If ever Ukraine were to be defeated, that 1 million drops out of the equation, and the balance of power tilts in Russia's favor, also because we are less sure of the American contribution. So it has become pretty much a vital interest for Europe, I think, that a sovereign Ukraine survives. As you said, Lord Robertson, Putin holds the card, to use Trump's word. So if there is a peace agreement, hypothetically, then I think we must realize that we Europeans must give Ukraine a security guarantee, because I think this is now all or nothing. If Russia wins, parts of Ukraine will be annexed, the rest will be a satellite state. If Ukraine survives, I think it is only viable if we fully integrate it into our structures, starting with the EU. But however we take it into EU, full membership or some light version, the day we take it in, Article 42.7 applies, the collective defense guarantee that is embedded in the EU treaty. We can't act upon that through the EU, but it doesn't make the obligation less binding. One cannot imagine that Ukraine is whichever manner that Ukraine is a member of the EU, that Russia attacks it anyway and we do nothing. then it is meaningless, right? So we have to give it a real security guarantee. My planning assumption is the US will not contribute to that guarantee. It may pretend to, but I think that this administration, under no circumstances, will go to war with Russia over Ukraine. Because it seems to me that the objective of Trump is not peace in Ukraine. That's the instrument. The objective is to normalize his relations with Russia. Therefore, Trump is quite willing to make enormous concession at the expense of Ukraine. Fortunately, we still have leverage because we have our own sanctions against Russia, we have our own support for Ukraine, and we control the Russian frozen assets. And as long as we don't seize them, but we hold them, they serve as collateral. That gives us leverage. So we could prevent Trump from imposing his 28 points on Ukraine. But he will try. He will continue to try. But it may well be that Putin decides to carry on the fight, in a way encouraged precisely by Trump's mixed messaging. Because I can well imagine a scenario, if the war continues, that Trump gets bored of it. He will find a reason to blame it all on Zelensky. He will say, I gave you a chance for peace. You didn't take it. Okay. You're on your own now, and then only we will support Ukraine, Europeans, and then maybe Putin will think he can win. I think he's mistaken. I think Ukraine will hold also with only European support. But the point is, whichever scenario, ongoing war or some sort of agreement, I think we better prepare for it, that we Europeans will have to continue to support Ukraine by ourselves. But this also, my other point, has important consequences for our own collective defense. The US has been very explicit. It could not have been more explicit. It tells us, organize your own conventional defense under the US nuclear umbrella. But conventional deterrence and fighting the conventional battle, you do that yourselves. And I still meet many people who don't want to hear it. I mean, I agree, it's not exactly a comfortable message, but they keep saying it and repeating it. So again, ignoring it would be foolish. It means that the entire basic assumption of everything that NATO has planned for is no longer valid. Because the whole NATO defense planning process assumes a massive conventional American contribution. All the existing regional defense plans assume a massive American reinforcement. The US government now says, perhaps, perhaps not. It seems to me that therefore, of every existing NATO plan, we need a plan B, or rather a plan A minus the Americans, What do we do? If we find ourselves in a conflict with Russia and the US administration says you're on your own, how can we still fight that battle today alone? And how do we want to be able to fight that battle in 5 years? It seems to me that we must undertake this exercise and make sure that within NATO, we create a complete set of forces, even discounting the US contribution. So in a way, I think we need to plan for 2 force packages rather than one integrated package. One simply is the United States, which of course has the full set of forces. It has everything at once and more. But everybody else together, and I include in that Canada and Turkey, our combined forces should be as complete as the American forces with our own strategic enablers, so that ultimately we can do whatever it is that we decide to do without needing a single American. So to conclude, don't misunderstand me. This is not a plea to decouple from the United States. It's just a plea to be realistic, to listen what the US is telling us, and to make the necessary decisions to take all of that into account. I would definitely hope that the next war will be fought with the United States. But there is one lesson from history. It's this. Europe cannot trust any non-European power to come to its aid the moment the first shots are fired. Who declared war in August 1914 and in September 1939? Britain and France declared war. The United States would probably never have entered the First World War if it weren't for a very inept German strategy. It would always have entered the Second World War. That was Roosevelt's strategy. But people forget that in 1940, when Roosevelt had to be elected, his election promise had to be that he would stay out of the war, because that was the mood of the American public. So first of all, let's count on ourselves. And if our American allies come to our aid, I would certainly wish so, but I would also be prepared to fight for ourselves. Thank you.
Well, I certainly also have some remarks to that. We'll come back to this, but just to put this out for a later discussion, the notion of President Trump's peace through strength, why might that not be applied towards deterring Russia in Europe? And that certainly there's a political angle to that. But before we kick it over, Brian, I wanted to discuss with you the issues of domestic governance and global order and how that relates. I mean, a lot of these domestic issues have come up in the panel because, well, when Americans vote, they decide the president. When I lived in Canada, a lot of my friends had a joke that, oh, everybody in the world should be able to vote in this election because, you know, it's going to decide, we're going to be impacted by it. That's true where we're sitting here and other parts of the globe. So Brian, over to you to take us through it.
Thank you very much, Louis, and thank you to the Baltic Defense College for the invitation. It's always wonderful to be in Estonia. As some of you may know, I've spent my adult life studying, analyzing, and commenting on political developments in Russia and in the former Soviet Union. And the curious aspect of our current situation right now is the degree to which this has now become increasingly relevant to contexts that are much, much broader than Russia or the former Soviet Union. This perpetual conflict that we now find ourselves engaged in has its roots in two separate but related struggles and two separate but related crises. The first of these is a struggle over domestic governance. This struggle pits a liberal democracy, which in much of the West, let's face it, is in crisis. And it pits this against what I call what I call gangsterism as governance. And this is basically an oligarchic, kleptocratic authoritarianism. And I'll unpack those in a minute. So that's the first. We have this struggle over domestic governance. The second crisis and the second struggle is a struggle over the global order. And here again, we have the post-war rules-based international order in crisis. Nobody's going to deny that, right? And vying to replace it is the potential emergence of an order based on spheres of influence in which, to quote Thucydides in the history of the Peloponnesian War, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Now, Ukraine is ground zero for both of these struggles and both of these crises, which means the way the Ukraine war resolves is going to have repercussions far beyond Ukraine. And I think everybody understands that. So let's unpack these two struggles and these two crises in turn. If the old Cold War was fought between states or among states, the new Cold War is being fought largely within states. Like the old Cold War, this is a struggle between two normative systems. On one hand, we have liberal democracy, which stresses civic patriotism, individual liberties, accountability, transparency, respect for institutions, the rule of law, and the sanctity of contracts. All these things we learned in civics class, right? Against that is, again, what I call gangsterism as governance, which is based on corruption, patron-client relationships, the merger of money and power, the subordination of law to money and power. And again, in essence, this is an unaccountable, non-transparent, autocratic, and arbitrary form of governance deeply rooted in Russian political culture, but which has transcended the Russian political context. This conception of gangsterism as governance, I developed this in an article I wrote back in 2024 for The Bulwark, which I was titled Mafiaism is the New Communism, which again described Russian politics then, but now I think it's beginning to transcend this. Now, gangsterism should not be attractive as a model to anybody, right? Who in their right mind would choose gangsterism? So what does gangsterism do? It exploits the fact that in the 21st century, Western liberal democracy has been experiencing the most acute crisis of confidence in at least a generation. And this goes for both sides of the Atlantic. From the 9/11 attacks and their aftermath, the Iraq War, the subsequent upheaval in the Middle East, the 2008 financial crisis, the subsequent Euro crisis, and migrant crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, all of these things have fed into this angst and this malaise. The economic and cultural shocks of globalization have caused a critical mass of citizens in the West to become alienated and disenfranchised. Advances in technology has put us at the mercy of algorithms owned by tech oligarchs that maximize and amplify outrage and turn that outrage into dollars, euros, pounds, and yen. The proponents of gangsterism have leveraged all of this by claiming that they are the champions of a new order that will replace liberal democracy. It stresses ethno-nationalism, stability, so-called traditional values, the restoration of a lost golden age. Its proponents have fed on a growing distrust of institutions and anxiety about social and economic and demographic change. Along these lines, back in February 2019, longtime Kremlin official Vladislav Surkov published a widely circulated article in the Russian newspaper Nezavisimaya Gazeta, in which he wrote the following, and I'm quoting now. Foreign politicians accuse Russia of interference in elections and referendums across the globe. In fact, it is even more serious than that. Russia is interfering in their brains, and they do not know what to do with their altered consciousness. Talk about saying the quiet part out loud. Now, what does this do? This puts us in an environment in which every election in a Western democracy is a potential crisis. And trust me, I know, I came here from Washington. But this show could be coming to a capital near you. It could be London, it could be Paris, it could be Berlin. God forbid, but we have to recognize this possibility. Which brings us to the second front in this war. What kind of international system will we now have? The proponents of gangsterism prefer a system in which the strong lord over spheres of influence. This allows them to spread their kleptocratic networks across borders, unbothered by the rule of law. In such a world, presumably Russia would get Eurasia, China would get Asia, and perhaps the United States would get the Western Hemisphere. And since I quoted Thucydides, what this world looks like, to quote another great thinker, the artist formerly known as Prince, would be partying like it's 1799. Right? Is there a way out of this? Is there a way out of this? I agree with Sven and Peter that as a committed Atlanticist, my preferred way out of this would be for a renewed Atlanticism in which the American commitment to European security remained. But we must be realistic, given the current political realities. And barring this requires the democracies that have not yet fallen victim to this virus of gangsterism to unite. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney alluded to this in a very important speech in Davos, urging what he called middle powers to unite. What would this look like? I actually did some math in preparation for this talk. If you looked at the free world minus the United States, if you combine the GDPs of the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, this comes out to, depending on which estimate you look at, between $30 and $36 trillion, or roughly between 25 to 29% of global GDP. This is equal to or greater than US GDP. It is much greater than the 20 trillion Chinese GDP, and it dwarfs Russia's 2.5 trillion GDP. We have a sleeping giant here, possibly. Now this, again, I would really prefer a renewed Atlanticism. I'm a committed Atlanticist and always have been, but we have to be realistic right now, and this is a possible alternative. And to wrap up, since I quoted the Canadian Prime Minister, I'm going to quote another great Canadian, Neil Young. And this would be, what would happen here, we'd be rocking in the new free world.
I like it. We'd be rocking in the new free world. No, thank you, Brian. I mean, the question about European security is always very interesting because you have to focus now on Russia, the aggressor, but then the non-European country, the United States. How do we talk about European security without the U.S., and how do we make it not all about the U.S.? And I think what I see in the past couple of years, maybe not right at 2022, somewhere around 23, 24, was this shift that, okay, we have to rebuild. We want the Americans to be in, but we have to rebuild and be prepared for them to be, I don't think ever out. I can't imagine that happening because, just a couple of points to make about the current administration. Well, they sent somebody as a perm rep. President Trump sent Ambassador Whitaker, who's really close with President Trump. They nominated a SACEUR. They have told Europe that they're still in it, but they'd like Europe to do more. And another thing is that didn't really start with the Trump administration. There was a long time to prepare for this 4-year gap in between administrations and even prior. Now we're seeing the Middle East engulfed again? And where does that take the eye? So I guess what I wanted to talk now about Europe and the United States is President Trump has this idea of peace through strength, but he does not seem to be applying it to Vladimir Putin in the same type of way, but he's got nukes. So where does that leave the political discussion? And then there's a question that was posed on Slido, and I will slightly rephrase this question because it is something that is not, people don't like it when you say it out loud, but to strategize. And there's even a book written, What If Russia Wins? I don't think that they'll ever be able to defeat Ukraine on the battlefield, but the big worry is what if there is a strategic victory that's politically negotiated behind other people's backs? Where does that put Europe? And is Europe able? What if they come? That's the question that probably most people who live in the Baltics get asked every day by friends and family members. Are we ready if and when they come? And Lord Robertson, you mentioned that you were the only Secretary General to invoke Article 5, and that is such a strong deterrent. Is that something that you foresee being perpetual? I'll open the floor to the panelists.
I think, of course, we're ready. And anyway, I think you have to think in terms of the perception of the other side. In the Kremlin, they think we're ready. They know we're ready, and that's why Article 5 is a guarantee that matters. And why the Baltic states, and ultimately Sweden and Finland as well, believed that that was the way of ensuring that kind of security. But we are underprepared. The fact is that Russia blundered into the invasion of Ukraine, making some terrible mistakes along the line, and they have not succeeded with their war aims. Even at the moment, they haven't even occupied the territory that they claim to have formally occupied, formally designated to be part of Russia, and they're making little or no progress on the battlefield. But they're modernizing, they're changing, and they're learning all the time. And therefore, the perspective that we had with our review, which was being ready for a peer competitor in 10 years, means that we need to think in much more realistically in terms of a confrontation that might take place earlier than that, and we need to be ready. We need to be ready for that. I mentioned in my opening remarks that I went to this somewhat bizarre meeting of the military club of the Russian Federation. So all these retired admirals and generals invited me to go 2008 to Moscow. And I made a speech about basically the pastoral role of former army military officers in dealing with the problems of retirement, whereas they were obsessed with NATO. And all of the speeches were about NATO as well. And I formed a view at the end of that conference that the military in Russia is completely nationalistic. It is very much proud of the country, the nature of the country, and the motherland takes priority. They are also profoundly conservative. They look at the threats to the motherland all the time, and they see NATO as a threat. And we need to have that. And when we launched the review on the 2nd of June last year, there was a demonstration outside the shipyard in Glasgow saying welfare, not warfare, as if that was a binary choice that we have. There is no welfare unless you have readiness for war in order to deter any adversary in the future, and therefore we need to build that capability, rebuild that capability, in order that the perception by the other side is not in any way doubted at all.
Yeah, there's a couple of thoughts here. I mean, I think we got to right-size Russia. And we tend to look at them either as this 10,000 feet giant or this little pipsqueak that could do nothing. We have to take a realistic look at what Russia's strengths are right now. And the fact of the matter is, the Russian economy cannot sustain this war. It cannot. There was a fantastic report that was just put out, not just put out, it was put out about a year ago by Craig Kennedy at the Davis Center for Russian Studies at Harvard, called Russia's Hidden War Debt, which to me was really revelatory because it was basically showing that the war is being financed by pressuring commercial banks to issue loans to defense contractors at below market rates that are never going to be paid back. And that is what has been allowing the macroeconomic situation to be much more resilient than we expected. That is not sustainable. That is not sustainable. And this is not a time to be throwing Russia a lifeline, because this war is going to be determined by whether Russia's economy collapses before it's able to advance in Ukraine. So that's the first point I would make. On the issue of Europe providing for its own defense, I think there's a lot of people in my country that are going to be in a situation of be careful what you wish for, because you may get it. Because this idea of telling Europe to spend whatever it is, 3%, 5%, whatever percent it is now, that is contingent on buying American kit. That's the unsaid part of that. Increase your defense spending, but buy American kit. What I'm starting to see now is Europe increasing its defense spending, and it's buying European kit. I'm telling my financial advisor, look at European defense contractors right now. That's where I want to be investing right now, right? We're seeing things developing right now, encouraging signs. Sweden is talking about building Gripens in Canada in partnership with Bombardier. Now I've read about this. Nothing's been signed yet, but it's being discussed. Poland is launching reconnaissance satellites right now in order to be able to replace one of the things that only America can provide for Europe right now, and that's strategic battlefield intelligence. So that we're in flux right now, and I just would be careful about assuming the way things have been is the way they're going to be, because I think we're going to see some changes in this regard.
Mm-hmm. No, it's interesting because you said it's time to right-size Russia. And I agree. And that's always a discussion about what if, when, how so. But I think that's a really important aspect to consider. But Peter, I do have a question for you, because I mentioned while we were still going through this notion of peace through strength. Why do you suppose that the current administration is not trying to use some of the leverage that Brian brought up to get Putin to knock it off and really to stop? Why hasn't there been more of a muscle flex, in your opinion?
I think peace through strength is a neocon attempt to co-opt America first by invoking an old Reagan phrase. It is successful insofar as Trump likes to push around those he feels he can force his will upon. And that includes Europeans and regimes that the United States has long sought to get rid of that look like they're on the verge of collapse. Although in the case of Iran, he may have overestimated his potential. But you see very clearly that Trump does not want high stakes military engagement, or even the risk of one. Again, he may have miscalculated horribly with this war in Iran, but everything he has said about both Russia and China, and much of his base in allies have been very hawkish about China. Trump personally is very accommodationist. All sorts of China hawkish lines were taken out of drafts of the National Defense Strategy, and there's great anticipation for this meeting in April. So he clearly puts China and Russia in a different category and has done so consistently. There's also a matter of leverage. A lot of people make the assertion that Washington can push Russia one way or the other. It seems to me that this has not been demonstrated, that the screws have been tightened on Russia repeatedly. There is always a promise that one more turn of the screwdriver will do it. But the Russian approach typically is to take this, to suffer and to persist. Seems like a strange gamble to me to believe that Putin will be pressured economically a little bit more. It will cross some magic threshold and he'll say, I'm done. Maybe, but I wouldn't count on it. And if I could just react to a couple of things I've heard on the panel quickly. I was interested in your examples of the two world wars as cases where Europe can't rely on the US coming to its aid and must save it.
Not from the start.
Not from the start, and must save itself. From whom? From itself. There's sort of an interesting illusion of whom the threat comes from, and in conversations with Europeans, there seems to be this belief that Europe is an eternal and unified actor. That has not been true throughout history. Conflict in Europe may be perpetual, but it is not always Russia that creates it. And again, we will see what happens, but if the US withdraws, I would not count on Europe remaining united and conceiving a common security policy. That may happen, but it will take hard work, and Europe, again, should not be just assumed to be an eternal unit. In spheres of influence are not some strange vestige that may have returned. They are an ever-present reality in global affairs. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in creating the United Nations, which is supposed to be the foundation of the so-called post-war order which we invoke, imagined 4 policemen cooperatively running the world. The Cold War with the free world and slave world was a different kind of competitive structure of spheres of influence, but spheres of influence nonetheless. And Trump has made the extent of the United States spheres of influence extremely obvious because he uses these levers very aggressively. And you can see the response when he tries to get India to do something, which is not in America's sphere of influence. Modi has some options. But when he goes to Japan, Korea, Europe, you see what happens. Because the US does have power, the structure is created in a certain way. And so the idea of a free world minus the United States, an alliance of the democratic middle powers might sound enticing, but I cannot begin to imagine how that would work. Japan and Korea and Europe and Canada cohering absent the United States. I mean, first of all, the United States would have to pull back substantially. Korea and Japan cannot just go off to cooperate with Europe without any American say-so, given, again, military presence there. But it seems like a stretch to me. And you can, again, you see it in behavior, because there is a big difference between some of these bold statements in action. So we'll see what Carney can pull off, but I think that speech was the extent of it.
I would think that, I mean, we have a bias to think that the world as it is the world as it's always going to be. And a lot of things are in flux right now. And I think the U.S. right now risks falling into this, the Thucydides trap, basically, of causing all of the middle powers to unite, if not against it, but to work around it. Right? And I think we're beginning to see signs of this. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow or next week, but we're seeing movement in this direction. We're seeing it in Europe. We're seeing it between Europe and Canada. And I think increasingly we'll begin to see it between Europe and Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand.
Sorry, I don't see any resistance to the United States. I mean, the U.S. just went into Iran, and Mark Rutte goes on American Newsmax, like right-leaning television, and says NATO is a platform for American power projection.
Well, he later backed off those comments and said what he was saying was he supports America's efforts to stop Iran.
In any case, it still looks like where the U.S. goes.
We're in early days. We're in early days.
It leads to a question of, how far out can the NATO SecGen go without being sure that actually the capitals are still behind them, because I'm beginning to think that Rutte goes very far, saying things that most heads of state and government don't want him to say. I mean, if I may, the difference is that Europe now is united voluntarily for the first time.
Yeah.
Voluntarily. It hasn't been forced into an empire. It voluntarily created the union in which we pool our sovereignty. I agree, nothing is eternal in international politics. That is definitely true. But the idea that, after 7 decades of European integration, the moment the US would pull back, France and Germany would go to war, seems a bit silly to me.
Why? Don't predict that.
I mean, we are sovereign states, yet at the same time we are provinces of the Eurozone and the single market. I think that's very important. So again, I'm not wishing for this American pullback, but I'm saying that I can see it quite conceivable. Because if you read the logic of this NSS, it's to say there are 3 great powers, not 4, 3. The United States, Russia, and China. Those are entitled, apparently, to a sphere of influence. whereas our role is to be obedient vessels. And what I think we should stress more is that, again, this strategy has basically opened hostilities against the project of the EU, right? I think you cannot kill the EU without killing NATO. The other way around is the same, but also if imagine what it means. If the EU evaporates, it means there goes the currency, there goes the single market. So you have total economic chaos, hence political chaos. But somehow, just on the other side of Brussels, things will go on running smoothly. It's just ridiculous. So if you kill one, you kill the other. But I'm not sure that this American president cares. I mean, his proactive agenda seems to be to get rid of the EU because with its regulations and so on, it stands in the way of his project, and it would be much easier if the Commission weren't there. You could impose your will on all these smallish countries. So that's his proactive project. I don't think he proactively wants to get rid of NATO, but frankly, I don't get the feeling he cares very much either. Because if the starting point is Vladimir is my buddy and I'm going to make a nice deal, then whether or not NATO survives is not number one on your agenda. That's why I say we should also look to ourselves for our own security. As you know, the first layer of solidarity is among ourselves Europeans. And I hope the second layer remains viable, but for the moment, I'm beginning to be doubtful.
Yeah, I would dispute the claim that the only thing keeping Europe unified is the United States. I think that's the peak of American arrogance to actually believe that. Europe voluntarily united and integrated in a horizontal fashion for the first time ever, which is, I agree with you, Sven.
I think we have yet to run that experience. Sorry.
We make the mistake of thinking that the Trump administration is the United States of America. It's not.
True.
And I think when the primary season is over this year, the Congress is going to start to assert itself much more than it has been up to now, and the midterms may well produce a change in the complexion of the government of the Congress as well. But it's the same mistake that we make in assuming that Russia is Putin. Putin is not the whole of Russia. It doesn't have a parliament. It is perfectly true, but it's conflating it as well. And again, the characterization in the national security strategy of the US, which sort of took various elements of European civilization as being the sort of determinant, is again a false analysis that is being made. Underneath it all is an appreciation of the strength of the European Union, which the United Kingdom opted out of, but is enduring, and the continuing role of NATO. Because not only has Finland and Sweden joined, France has also become part of the integrated military command, which wasn't the case in my day. They were sort of country members of NATO at that point, but actually it has developed over a time, and I don't think that is in any great danger to do with that. But we need to sort of try stopping thinking about things in very simplistic terms. Even when Mark Carney, another non-politician becoming a politician, talks about a rupture and talks about middle powers. If we're all middle powers, who are the big powers? Is it Russia, China, with spheres of influence? And yet, what you rightly say is Russia is not a middle power.
2.5 trillion GDP. In what universe is that a great power?
But it's got nuclear weapons, and so do we.
Yeah.
And we're permanent members of the UN Security Council.
So
are we the big ones? Who are the middle ones? That's why I think these theories, collapse.
Well, I think we're going to see changes on who has nuclear weapons going forward too. I mean, we all heard Chancellor Merz's comments regarding the French extending their nuclear deterrent to all of Europe. I think we're hearing different countries in Europe. Poland comes to mind, thinking of acquiring their own nuclear deterrent. I mean, the NPT is probably dead, and there's going to be there's a lot of countries that can just flip a switch and have a nuclear weapon, right? And I think the only thing stopping them from doing that was the norms of the NPT. But the NPT, let's face it, is dying. And we're going to see more countries with nuclear weapons. And then where is Russia as a great power then? Right? They're a great power by virtue of the fact that they were one of 5 declared nuclear powers. Right?
So you can have a lot of nuclear weapons. You only need to have one. in order to inflict a huge amount of damage.
Yeah.
And therefore, the investment that Russia is making in nuclear weapons, is nugatory. At the end of the day, that is an investment that can't be used short of Armageddon.
Yeah, and literally that is the only thing that gives them claim to be a great power. It's certainly not their economy, and as we're seeing now, it's certainly not their conventional military.
Mm-hmm. Peter, I think you wanted to jump in?
Well, I just wanted to respond to the remark about American arrogance. I would humbly submit that we have yet to run the experiment of trying to see a Europe united absent the American umbrella. Europe has united horizontally, but there is a vertical dimension to this that is difficult to deny. NATO is a big part of the European integration structures, and it is dominated by the United States. So I, in my initial presentation, said that there were two options, fragmentation and further integration. So I do not pretend that it is absolutely essential that Germany and France will go to war the minute the US withdraws. But the assumption that Europe will cohere is a risky one and an untested one, because again, Europe has been united twice in its long history, under Rome and under the United States. This integration may endure, but if it does, it will have to cohere in entirely new and novel fashion.
I would say the determining factor today for me is not the presence or not of the United States, it's domestic politics.
Yeah.
The only one who can bring the US down is the US own anti-democrats. The only one who can bring the EU down, or Europe, is our own anti-democrats.
Exactly.
That's the big challenge, I would say.
Well, before we go on to the Q&A, I do want to touch upon one of your points, Peter, the reboot of the transatlantic relationship, but with sort of a new twist. You mentioned a tech and trade agreement. I tend to agree that that's probably the most likely course of action, because for the first time we're seeing a NATO with a slightly potential different role of the United States, no longer as the sole driver, but they're saying, okay, we're still in it, but we're going to let some of the heavy lifting be done on the continent, which to me does seem like a multilateral 32-member consensus-based organization. And I think that you hit it on the nail, on the bullseye there with tech and trade. Brian, you mentioned, companies buying European now, and it really does seem that, they're willing to, the United States is willing to let go of a little bit of political control. It would have been one thing if they said, okay, we have Secure, but we also want SecGen, but they are, asking politically for more to be done. So I think maybe the way to get through this perpetual conflict is imagine, the old saying for NATO, keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. Keep the Americans in, keep the Russians deterred, and elevate all the other allies. So your final thoughts on that before we kick it to the audience?
Is that to me or to people?
To the whole panel, very briefly.
Well, I can start since I proposed this shift from tanks and troops to tech and trade. I wrote a foreign affairs article on the subject not too long ago. So what is the value proposition of NATO to the United States at the moment? In Washington, it is being disputed because, again, the Russian conventional threat to the United States is not apparent. And that is the entire basis of the alliance, is countering that threat. So it's a cost that can be recouped if we sell our weapons very dearly. But that's kind of strange arrangement as the foundation of the core relationship between North America and Europe. Now, cyberspace, outer space, AI, management of resources, that is a major priority for the United States, and one would think for the entire West, with China being, again, the measuring stick. But in any case, this is important. The security concerns of the 21st century, the economic imperatives of the 21st century are in these spheres precisely. And Europe does have something to offer. ASML, you could have any number of other companies that add their input to this common endeavor. And right now there is a trade war between the United States and the EU, but if some common structure were conceived, one could imagine a mutually beneficial arrangement that creates a sort of economic and tech bloc. And I think if you listen to Vance's speech before his scandalous Munich speech, he gave a speech at the AI summit in Paris where he gestured towards such a thing. And I think a lot of what is meant under the guise of Western civilization, you can get lost in the culture war stuff. But is precisely the creation of this kind of bloc that could stand up as a pole relative to China just because you need sufficient scale to do so. And that is true of the United States, it's true of Europeans, who will be too small to compete when it comes to AI or outer space, even if they cohere as an entire continent, and again, that is under question. And finally, I think there is an irony that this would not be some novel development. This would be a return to the original American intention when the transatlantic relationship was created. What was the purpose? It was the Marshall Plan. It was economic reconstruction of Europe, the imposition, whatever, creation of American standards, and NATO was the price the US paid to get this economic project underway. Kennan basically said that this is like a psychological problem that the Europeans have. We can assuage it through security guarantees so that they have the will politically to do the economic reconstruction that is necessary. But the Marshall Plan ran out after 4 years. Economic integration became a separate European project, and the US remained stuck in the security relationship. And again, it's interesting that this core relationship of the modern order and of American hegemony is a security one. The only institution that binds North America to Europe is a security alliance. It doesn't have to be the case. And I see more variety in the future if this relationship is going to endure.
I would say yes, but only on the premise that it's not one bloc, but an equitable economic partnership between two blocs. One being the EU, with partners, let's say EU plus, one being the United States. And to me, it makes sense that we say as Europeans that not just for every piece of military kit, but in AI and cyber and so on and so forth. I'm not saying buy only European, but I would like to have a European alternative for everything that is essential that I can choose, so that I do not need to rely not on anybody, not on something made in the US, not on something made in China or Taiwan. I want to always have a European alternative. It just seems logical. And don't forget, you now have the US ambassadors, was it to EU and NATO, actively lobbying for us, saying don't buy European. I mean, what is the point of this? So yes, but on an equal footing. There will not be one single transatlantic economic bloc, I think.
Yeah, and we could be in a situation to be careful what you wish for, because you're correct. American ambassadors have been critical of Europeans buying European kit, which is kind of weird, right? Like somebody were criticizing America for buying American kit. Is that not strange, right? But that's what we're seeing, because so much has been accustomed to the dominance of the American defense sector. But I think that is going to change. Not tomorrow, not next week. And I would also say, you're right, Peter, that the security guarantee gave Europe the space and the confidence to integrate. But now the European project is far beyond that. It's taken on a life of its own that's gone far beyond that. And I do not think for a minute that removing the American piece from the equation, which I do not advocate, but which is a distinct possibility, I do not think that would lead to the collapse of European unity. I just don't see that.
There was a statement issued a couple of weeks ago by the former US ambassadors to NATO and the former SECURs, given very little coverage, I have to say, in the European press, but which actually outlined very clearly the advantages, both economic and militarily, of the United States being in NATO, and what it would cost America, both in financial and military and political terms, to actually withdraw from NATO. Yep. It would be a huge increased cost in order to duplicate what the European members of NATO actually contribute to the alliance as a whole. $500 billion worth of defence expenditure is being spent by the European members of NATO, and that amplifies and exaggerates American influence in the world. The imbalance inside NATO means that America has got a disproportionate influence in the activities of a 32-nation alliance, where nobody's even contemplated, not a single member has ever contemplated coming out of the NATO alliance as a whole. So in a way, we've allowed a narrative, and I plead guilty as well to that, allowed this narrative to be gained all the time, that we're leaning all the time on America. We need it for a whole series of heavy lifting aspects, and in terms of strategic transport, intelligence, satellite communication, and the rest of it. But America gets a huge amount out of being in an alliance with 31 automatic allies sitting every week round a table, basically listening disproportionately to the American influence inside Europe.
Allies are force multipliers. I mean, it's that simple.
Huge force multiplier as well. As is now illustrated, when America is now going to penalise Spain for not allowing, the bases to be used for the attack on Iran. So suddenly, the Trump administration has realised how important the bases are inside the NATO alliance as well.
But force multiplier to achieve what ends? Defeat in Afghanistan and Iraq, the debacle ongoing in Iran, no advantage against China in the areas that matter. So I have heard the arguments about bases, about the military spending, but I would prefer that the spending in Europe, if it were done jointly with the United States, were on more productive portions of social activity than the purely military, which in my lifetime has been spent in destructive enterprises that have cost the United States dearly. So, I mean, there has not been any proven positive effect from this added European military dimension that I can see.
Well, that's a retrospective sort of justification. Afghanistan and Iraq were operations which may have ended up as debacles, but that's not the point. The fact is that when the United States wanted to take action, it was able to mobilize inside NATO the argument in order to get support for what they're doing, right or wrong, whether it's right or wrong.
When American servicemen and women are injured in the field, where are they treated? In Europe. Because they don't have to go all the way back to the U.S. It saved a lot of American lives.
Perhaps if we did not have this forward position, we would be less interested in waging these wars and would not then require this assistance. So as far as I'm concerned, it would have been better not.
Pretty heroic assumption, that.
Well,
especially at the moment.
It is, yes. I agree. The glass is sometimes more than half empty.
Indeed. Well, this is a very engaging panel, but I do want to give the audience some time to ask some questions. So I've got a couple from Slido, but I want to give the chance to maybe 3 audience participants. We'll take 3 at a time, 1, 2, and 3. Please state your name and affiliation and direct your question to either an individual panelist or the panel at large. In the front, sir, go ahead.
Thank you. Krzysztof Pająk, commander from the War Studies University in Poland. It's a rather long one, but I think very important. So talking about the deterrence and the sole defense spendings does not bring much value. It is the capabilities that matter. The threat is high, and we need to prepare for the worst case scenario. Fighting alone and not united, and in the perspective of the conflict coming sooner than later. The issue is that the capabilities we need to deter Russia are important, right? And we don't necessarily need to deter Russia, but we need the capabilities to defeat Russia when it attacks. And for sure, Russia is a different country. Its political leaders don't really care about the society. They don't care about the economy. They can do whatever they want just to maintain the power. And this is the issue we need to take into consideration. So, we have seen that Russia is not vulnerable to high war losses, high suffering of its soldiers, and it never was. Mm-hmm. But the war is a system. It's anchored in the economy, it's anchored in the money, and it's anchored in the industry and economy itself. And the question is here, if we even are able to stop Russia, how to provide us with the capabilities to stop the Russian industry, Russian economy running, right? How to stop Russian oil exports if they have access to 4 bodies of water and 2 of them are very far away from Europe. And the question is also how to provide Europe with industrial capabilities to produce enough drones. I don't know how many for the next war, but maybe about 10, 20 million a year. And the shells with the same number, just in time and ready to deliver to the front.
Thank you for your questions.
Yep.
If you could try to just make it really succinct.
This is the question, right?
Yes.
And one final remark, because it's also important to keep it in mind. So there was much about hope here, but hope is not a good fundament for the strategy and strategic planning. The numbers are important.
Yep. And was that directed to the entire panel, sir?
Yes,
okay.
Correct.
I think we'll collect all the questions at once before giving the panelists a chance to respond. There was a question in the back over. Yes, Imar.
Thanks, Louis. Wow, sorry. And thanks to the entire panel. My name is Imar Kuchkali. I work for the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And my question was prompted by one of the comments. I think Sven mentioned how Trump's strategy, or Trump wants to have an agreement or a peace agreement in Ukraine. And my question is, what is the objective? Is it peace for the sake of peace? Does Trump want to be remembered as a peacemaker? Yesterday I was listening to a political analyst who said that everything the administration does can be reduced to the idea that there's going to be a war with China 5 to 10 years from now. Is the strategy here to pull Russia back towards the US camp, or is there a third option that I haven't considered? And this is also a question to the whole panel.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thanks again.
And then, yes, ma'am, in front. Harry, we can take your question after, because I did see you at the sign. The mic is coming just behind you there.
Thank you very much. Gabija Damlakita, Ministry of Defense, Lithuania. So we ended the panel with discussion what is the benefit for United States having European allies. But when there is another debate could be what's the Russia's allies, taking into account the recent development. Does the changes in Venezuela, Iran now, or Syria strengthens or diminishes the Russian threat posed to Europe and Russia's strength in general? Okay.
Feel free to jump in, panelists.
Yeah, I mean, Sven, I think you and I are in agreement on this. Putin wants to do business with Russia. I mean, Trump wants to do business with Russia. That's clear. And he views Ukraine as an irritant to being able to do business with Russia. Look who he sent as envoys, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. Right? The goal here, and Trump has long wanted to do business with Russia. So I don't think it's any more sophisticated than that. There are those in the administration that do believe in this so-called reverse Kissinger, peeling Russia away from China, which I think is highly dubious and unlikely. On the second question, you hit it on the head. Russia's being exposed as an unreliable ally here. Whatever one thinks of the American operations in Venezuela and Iran, what both of those have done is expose that Russia is a very unreliable ally. And you add to that Syria, and even before that, Armenia. Even in the former Soviet space, Russia did not have the bandwidth, the will, or the capacity to come to the aid of its allies. So this is one, again, exposing, and going back to my comments, we need to right-size Russia and stop looking at them like this giant, because they're not.
At the same time, to say they were hardly essential to Russia's war effort. So losing Venezuela, losing even Iran, Syria, I think the impact on that, Russia's actual war against Ukraine.
Reputational damage.
Reputations, but I mean to the actual war effort will sadly be limited.
No, China's the one they can't lose.
We're going to say that the same point applies to China in a way. These were also supposedly China's friends, but when China will, of course, not go to war for anybody. And I think the Chinese are quite ready to work with whoever is in power in Iran and are probably gearing up. But I want to bring in this China factor. It was also mentioned in one of the questions. I mean, I think, turning Russia against China, think about it, the geopolitics of Russia. There's Siberia, full of resources, but nobody lives there. And just across the border is 1.3 billion Chinese. What do you have to offer Russia to entice it to turn against China? Nothing is impossible, but it seems, it seems tricky to offer that. My feeling is, but the American colleagues know better, that Trump's own preference is that to also make a big deal with Xi Jinping. Yeah. But there are obviously others in the administration who rather see a war coming. Yeah. China factor, I mean, a lot of people like to say, oh, China is hollowing out the world order. China is building a parallel world order. It's not really what they've been doing. They've been very cleverly gaining power within the world order, gaining positions in the UN and so on and so forth. I think the question is rather, what is their calculus now? If the Trump administration continues on this track, where they pull out of important parts of the order. Imagine, just for the sake of the argument, President Trump saying, I have my peace board now, I really like how it works, since I chair it. What's the point of this Security Council? I stop sending my ambassador. Empty chair policy, like the Soviets in the 50s, right? What do we do? What do the Chinese do at that point? Do the Chinese say, now is our time, so now we dominate the system? Or do they say, well, now there's no point, because it's a US-centered system. If the US pulls out, there is no system, so then we actually have to build a parallel system, and that leaves us Europeans in total isolation. I think this is some of the big questions that we all have to ask ourselves. Not, is China about to start to conquer the world, though they are obviously a rival and using hybrid actions against us that is evident. But because our interest is, we Europeans, we're an export economy, and we need to import all of our natural resources. So our vital interest is that we keep a world order that is as universal as possible, in the sense of as many countries as possible stay in and apply the rules, so that we can trade and invest with as many as possible. If that falls apart in spheres of influence that decouple, we are the one who stands to lose the most. So that's why, for me, it's not so often talked about. We focus on wars, but this is as vital for us, I think.
I think we definitely have around another 3 rounds. I saw a gentleman in the back, up front, and over there. Just a kind reminder, please keep the questions as questions and make them as short and succinct as possible.
I'm Major Harri Lahtein from Force Transformation Command, Estonian Defense Forces. I grew up under the Soviet occupation, so I don't have any warm and fuzzy feelings about the Russians. As being a major in Estonian Defense Forces, we are trying to get our state ready to fight a war with Russia. So all the ideas that we think that maybe there is a change in Russia or possible good guys coming out to want to be Democrats again, I don't see that. That being said, I also see that, as Lord Robertson said, Putin is not Russia. Well, indeed, if today Putin looks out of the window of the Kremlin that slips, it's slippery windows in Moscow, and drops to his death, nothing will change. Putin is not the reason. Putin is a product of society's development. Somebody else will step in and it will continue as it was. So my question is, if we want to live happily and freely in Europe, only way ahead is a disintegration of Russia. So are we afraid of disintegration? What could be the outcome if Russia falls apart and there will be a lot of little nations with nuclear weapons fighting with each other?
Great, thank you.
The whole panel.
Paul?
Hi, I'm Pauls. I'm a citizen from the Latvian MOD, and over the past few years, we've seen the EU fledge out very overarching and ambitious plans for enhancing defense capabilities such as SAFE and the white paper on EU readiness and so forth. However, one possible obstacle is the fact that the Union has to merge the interests of all of its members, and also its the interests of the Commission and the Council and the Parliament. And so my question is, do you think that these plans, these instruments, will be like efficient enough to compete with the US and also Russia's output of industrial capacity and capabilities? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And the gentleman right over in the back. Yes, sir.
First of all, United States Air Force 627 Air Mobility Command, Senior Airman Choi. I have a question to Professor Brian, that you mentioned NPT is dead now. The NPT?
Yeah.
Yes, because I have a question about this. Before the Trump administration, as you know, North Korea, the US has been proposing CBID for almost a couple of decades. And then that's what happened before the Trump administration kicking in. There was time to pivot to Asia. And what you see right now is that NPT is dead because of the US foreign policy was failed, or I'm just trying to figure out on your opinion, because the United States has been putting lots of efforts, denuclearization of the CBID in North Korea. And North Korea is now participating in the war in Ukraine. They're gaining a lot of the support from Russia, North Korea. They're making treaty alliances, like military alliances right now. But when it comes to thinking about the CBID, that's why I heard a lot of the experts telling that was unattainable. But that's why Obama administration got lost. And what we have now, the Trump administration has having the same issue. And that's kind of what I heard. Some of the CBID in North Korea, what you guys trying to achieve, caused the failure of the NPT, and that's what we're seeing right now. Or second quick question, quickly. If the Ukraine has a nuclear weapon, that's what I heard, then Russia is not going to invade Ukraine. That's other aspects of what I heard. Do you agree with that? So I'm trying to gain some aspects of your opinion as well when it comes to NPT. Thank you.
Okay, and panelists, I'm just going to provide the Slido questions because we have a lot, and I want to give at least one to you from Slido. If Russia proves capable of sustaining this level of aggression for another decade, and Brian, you talked about the fact that that is likely not possible, what is the plan B for Europe that has exhausted political will? So in 6.5 minutes.
I guess I'll take the NPT one first. The NPT, I didn't say it's dead, I said it's dying. And it's dying for two reasons. First, because it wasn't really fully working. I mean, we saw we saw India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea all acquire nuclear weapons outside of the NPT. So the NPT was already something of a fiction, but now it's dying because countries that were under the American nuclear umbrella do not believe that. They do not trust that security guarantee anymore. It's that simple. So I think that's where we are with the NPT. On the question about Russia breaking up, and I think the major touched on an old debate among Russia watchers: is this a Putin problem or is this a Russia problem? I don't have I'm of the view that it's a Russia problem. I think Putin was the product and I spent the 90s in Russia and watched the conditions which led to him rising. I think I tend to agree with the major there. The answer is not the breakup of Russia. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the answer is containment. And the last question from Slido was
if Russia is able to sustain the continued level of aggression towards Ukraine for another decade, what is a plan B for Europe as Russia continues, if they do? And you may think that they don't, because it was an interesting remark that you made about how they're really...
Well, right now, economically, this is not sustainable. And I know we've been crying wolf about this for a long time, but I think pretty soon the wolf's going to be at the door. They've been financing this war off books, and it is not sustainable. And I think this is the bill is going to come due sooner or later. The plan B is for I mean, Ukrainian security, in my opinion, and European security are one and the same. And recognizing that they are one and the same. Ukraine is Europe, and Europe is Ukraine in this sense. And that the plan A, B, C, D, E, F, and G is to defend Ukraine with all the resources Europe can muster, with or without the United States.
I agree. I would just pick up the point on the Commission's defense industrial instruments. I'm not a big expert on that, but I think there's a whole instrumentarium there now, but it can only be put to use if the states really decide what it is that they want. I think there's some interesting steps now made. For example, the declaration earlier this week by Macron and Merz about the deep strike capability, because we need to decide, do we want our own strategic enablers, yes or no? If the answer is yes, then this whole instrumentarium can be put to good use. As long as we sort of keep debating but don't really do it, then you can do nice little things with it, but not the big decisive things.
Can I just, 2 questions from the previous round. Why does Trump want a deal in Ukraine? First, I think he sincerely wants to make peace. Obviously, the war in Iran seems to indicate a different set of motivations, but nonetheless, he desperately wants a deal in Ukraine because he wants the laurels of having made the biggest peace deal available. There is also a strategic consideration, one regarding Europe, the other China. So the administration came in, I think, with ambitious expectations about resetting the transatlantic relationship, but figured that that could be done only after a Ukraine deal was reached, and they thought that that would happen quickly and then set them up to do these more difficult structural changes. But Ukraine has proven to be an unresolvable crisis and a bottleneck for this aspect of American policy, and this, I think, gives the Europeans a fairly rational motivation to prevent a deal or keep the crisis going because it keeps the Americans in. And then on the China angle, I would not dismiss the reverse Kissinger so easily. Who cares about the concept, the name? But I think the administration believes not that Russia can be peeled away from China or made adversarial to China, but that Russia, for its own reasons, would like to be less dependent on China, to balance against China. Even under current circumstances, Russia is trying very hard to put India and China on the same pedestal symbolically, to pursue relations with Korea, North and South, quietly, with Vietnam, and so on and so forth. So even in these conditions they are balancing. If Russia has more room to maneuver, it will balance much more aggressively and seek to reduce its dependence on China. I think this is what the administration is counting on, and I don't think that they're wrong to have this assumption, and they do not expect more than that. And this really quickly is one reason why the United States does not want a disintegrated Russia. That would then, parts of it, be easy prey for China in the current Washington thinking. So a Russia that is relatively strong helps create a global balance against China.
Yeah, but can you do that without doing it at Ukraine's and Europe's expense? That's the fear that we have.
I'm just explaining the Washington perspective. And then on Iran, very quickly, there is a reputational hit for Russia, sure, but there is also a reputational hit for the West. There are 2 billion plus Muslims in the world, not to mention any number of other non-Westerners, who see this in Europe's qualified support and think, what on earth is going on, when they speak about the existential stakes of supporting the liberal order from territorial aggression of Russia. So the reputational hit goes both ways. And then on the material side of things, I think it's pretty clear. Energy prices go up, good for Russia. Missile interceptors get used up in the Middle East, good for Russia.
Well, Lord Robertson, final word to you, sir.
Right. I can understand how the Major doesn't have warm, sort of fuzzy feelings about Russia, having lived under the occupation. But I fear if we get trapped in historical guilt, where does it stop? I was reading on the plane coming out a novel just for entertainment by Bernard Cornwell about the Danish occupation of the United Kingdom and how brutal it was in the 6th century, and how much we should reflect on Denmark today. We all want Germany to spend more money on defence, to build its capabilities. That is not the sentiment of 50 years ago, when the idea of German rearmament was hugely controversial, but we take that view. There's historically been, between England especially and France, the view that there was something in the genes of these nations that made them warlike as a whole. So I think we have to think beyond that and make sure that we create the institutions that will change these perceptions around. I used to say that the old thing about NATO being for keeping the Americans in and keeping the Russians down, keeping the Germans down, should be reformed as keeping the Americans in, try to get Russia in, and get the Germans to spend more money on defence. And that was the reverse of what it used to be before. But the European Union, the question was asked about whether the institutions of the European Union are sufficient. And that's a good question. But it's at least a start. What the SAFE programme, the having a European Commissioner for Defence, these are steps in a direction where the European Union is beginning to take responsibility for the defence of its nations as a whole. And I think that has to be good. So it is the EU plus the United Kingdom, then that is the best way of doing it. The final point I would make, because it was the last question about have we got the political will for Plan B. That is where we all have a role to play. Political opinion outside of the Baltic states, outside of Poland and the frontline states, is not sufficiently aware of how necessary it is to rebuild war readiness in order to deter. Because that has to be the objective, that we are strong enough and have enough capabilities to make sure that nobody in the future is going to decide to do what Russia has done to Ukraine today and create peace, peace through strength, prepare for war in order to provide peace. But public opinion in the rest of Europe has got to be mobilized so that ministers of finance know that it is a priority. So I'm preaching to the choir here because you all agree with that. But unless public opinion is galvanized, from Portugal across to Greece, and finance ministers know that it's a priority, then we will continue to be unsafe. That is the lesson.
Well, thank you, Lord Robertson, and thank you, panelists. Time really does fly. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give me a round of applause for our nice panelists. And I'd like to remind everybody that lunch will be served. For those of you with VIP badges, it'll be to your right and my left. And for the rest of the cohort, we're outside of the conference hall or downstairs. And there will be, at 1 to 2, a reminder to come back to the conference hall. Bon appetit, enjoy your meal, and see you back in an hour.